League of Women Voters Forum. A carbon price is right. Harnessing the market to drive down carbon emissions.
The idea of a carbon tax is to use a taxation or a fee mechanism, however one wants to describe that, and add to that direct cost that is then borne by those who choose to use that product.
The idea is you put a price on the very thing that causes the damage to society, the emission, the greenhouse gas emissions. And then you flexibly allow those actors in the market, those people who actually buy and sell the good that produces pollution, to decide what's best for themselves, what's the best response. The regulator, the policymaker, even the researcher doesn't actually know what is the cheapest course of action. There's a lot of uncertainty, and over the long haul, it's just hard to know. So we put the price on the thing that does the damage, and we let the actors in the market decide for themselves.
With the presumption then by driving that cost higher, you might discourage or deter that use, and with it encourage the greater use of other kinds of energy alternatives. That's somewhat different than cap and trade, and yet both fall under the orbit of carbon pricing. If we think of early examples of carbon taxes, think of the 5 Nordic countries that between 1990 and 1992, with very different political coalitions, adopted some version of a carbon tax that cut across all fossil fuels and has been in place now for quite some time. Cap and trade, a little different approach and a little different model, but at the end of the day, you're moving toward a strategy that does not involve a strict, strident government regulation where all fossil fuel sources have to respond in exactly the same way, or the exact identical technology that has to be used. This is a different strategy than a regulatory strategy or other kinds of mechanisms.
Carbon fee and dividend. It's a proposal that's put forth by a nonpartisan grassroots organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, for which, in the spirit of full disclosure, as you've already heard, I've been volunteering since March of 2013. It is what we feel is the best first step to addressing climate change. You know, when a bathtub is overflowing, this is equivalent to turning off the faucet. It doesn't solve everything, but it's what we think is the critical first step. It is a type of carbon tax, and it's one which we like to describe as a 3-legged stool. The first leg of the stool is the fee, and it's placed directly on fossil fuels, as far up on fossil fuel companies, not on the consumers, as far upstream as possible. So that's when the oil or the coal or the gas is coming out of the ground or into the country. Our proposal starts low and then goes up predictably. Starts low at about $15 per ton, and then it increases very transparently and very predictably by $10 per ton. And that's of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. So it covers not only CO2 but other greenhouse gases as well. This fee then creates a very transparent and predictable market signal to businesses and entrepreneurs so that they can know that it's time to transition to the low carbon economy. The second leg, and what distinguishes carbon fee and dividend from your typical carbon tax, is the second leg, which is called the dividend. Our proposal suggests that rather than the government keeping the money, it would return all of net revenues equitably back to U.S. households in the form of an equal monthly dividend. That makes it a revenue neutral type of carbon tax. But I want to end with the third leg of the stool, and that is a carbon border adjustment. And it's an adjustment that's applied to businesses trading manufactured goods, not fossil fuels, but manufactured goods, between countries, one country with a fee or a price on carbon and the other country without an equivalent price.
I actually like CCL's proposal, which is to give the dividend back to each household purely as a function of how many adults there are in the household and how many children there are in the household. There's a clear simplicity to that, and there's also a clear sense of absolute fairness. But there isn't really one definition of fairness here. There's a lot of different options. As far as the vehicle for the transfer, that could be a check in the mail, an electronic deposit, tax credits of a variety of kinds, such as we've seen in some other carbon pricing examples in British Columbia, for instance. Or you could make in-kind transfers. You could make investments targeted in certain communities for improved environmental quality, further improvements, or infrastructure, or education, any number of things. I think that probably the check in the mail is the best way to do it because that gives the family the option of, they get to decide what's the best use for the money. And we already, the IRS already sends checks in the mail through the tax code. So there's no added administrative complexity.
A great many governments around the world have, within the last 3 or 4 years, adopted some form of a carbon policy. South Africa, Chile, South Korea. China formally launched its cap and trade program in January of this year. One outside the U.S. that's especially interesting to think about is our Canadian neighbors. And there, the Trudeau government, a Liberal Party government, is proposing creating a pan-Canadian carbon price, which basically says to every Canadian province and territory, we're saying you have to create a price, and you cannot work your way out of it, but you get to set the terms. And with it, you also get to keep the revenue and decide how that revenue is going to be utilized.
According to the household impact study, with carbon fee and dividend, almost 90% of those below federal poverty level would come out ahead. Similarly, people of color would tend to do better than white people. People in rural areas did about the same as the national average and slightly better than suburban areas. And many of these findings we think are related to the fact that in general, the wealthier one is, the more one consumes, and the bigger one's carbon footprint. Why do we see job creation though? And the answer with that lies in what people do when they have more money in their pockets, especially those who are more economically challenged. Many of them would go take care of their health, go shopping, go out to eat, fix up their home. And that's where we see the job growth according to the Rabe report. So the bottom line is that the equal dividend check is critical to the equation because it protects the most economically vulnerable during the transition while at the same time stimulating the economy.
Corporations, businesses of all kinds, they don't like uncertainty. It's hard to strategically plan for the future when you don't know what the regulatory framework or environment is going to be like in the future. Okay, so there's some certain modest cost that actually is preferable to regulatory uncertainty, to not knowing what's coming down the pipeline from the regulator. If you have that certainty that there is going to be some form of regulation of greenhouse gas emissions, then for sure, without question, corporations are going to prefer carbon pricing. That's the one that stands the best prospect of allowing them to minimize costs. Okay, it's also it gives them the most power. The ball is in their court, how they are actually going to comply with this policy. That, I think, is really powerful. If there's going to be policy, firms want it to be carbon pricing. Okay, and not necessarily because they want to game the system or because they want to take advantage of consumers, though that may happen in cases. We have to be careful of that. Okay, but because they're actually trying to minimize costs. There could be a first mover competitive advantage as well. You show your support early, you invest in figuring out ways to lower your compliance cost curve, and that can get you started as well, give you an advantage. So I think there's lots of reasons why corporations could actually support carbon pricing and do.
This is not an easy lift in political terms. If one looks at the track record of governments in North America, carbon pricing out of the galaxy of different options that jurisdictions can adopt, not because they're good economically, but because they work politically, are among the less likely to be adopted. There are alternatives that are not nearly as effective in economic grounds, but they're much more popular in political grounds. To mandate increases in renewable energy, to mandate some of those scrubbers or other kinds of technologies are clearly problematic from an economic standpoint, but politically it's much, much easier to disguise the costs.
But I think the other thing that's often not factored into it is the fact that is the direct health impacts that occur often with families that are living very close to processing plants or live in urban areas that have to deal with the burning of the fossil fuels. Again, when we're talking about these direct health impacts, we're really not talking about greenhouse gas emissions. What we're talking about are things like ozone and fine particulate matter. But that leads to hundreds of thousands of premature deaths every year right here in the U.S., hundreds of thousands of ER visits due to asthma, missed school days, and hundreds of billions of dollars in healthcare costs every year. In fact, there's an MIT study that says that because carbon pricing would encourage the transition to a low-carbon economy, just the improvements from air quality that would occur from transitioning would offset the cost of implementation of the policy by up to 10 times.
To the extent that the poor devote more of their income to energy, then that component of carbon pricing is going to be regressive. I mean, the first line of defense against that is what we have been talking about the whole time, this dividend, this revenue usage. Okay, that's really the main vehicle for targeting, for making something regressive into something progressive, as Lisa said earlier. I also think that the benefits of the avoided climate damages are, if anything, more likely to accrue to poorer folks.
That's
They
right.
live closer to the pollution. They're less able to adapt because of their shorter incomes.
And I think in some circles and in many places, the idea has been you gather people to the left of center and find some way to win an election and jam through a bill or a regulation and hope it sticks. What we've seen, including the United States, but around the world, that recipe really tends not to work. And I would argue there are lessons in carbon pricing that suggest unusual coalitions, but also unusual times and moments that emerge and make it possible. We all can do it. And wouldn't it be great if the next time we come together, there are multiple jurisdictions and we can really talk about real world cases and examples, building on the kinds of ideas all my colleagues have suggested and your questions have brought forward. So thank you all very much.